So here we're going to introduce some of the key types of costs that a business needs to know about. And just before we do that, we're going to look at a couple of other key terms and definitions that you're going to need for cost of production as a topic. So first two things I want to point out to you there are these two things, the short run and the long run. Two terms that you're going to come across. You'll see it here in cost of production, but they're terms that we use a lot when we study market structures as well. And how we define these periods of time, the short run and the long run for a business, is they're not like set periods of time. It's not like the short run we say is 6 months and the long run is 12 months. In economics, how we define these two periods of time is actually by the factors of production, right? So if you look here, and this is how you'd explain the short run if you were given the definition in an exam, it's a period of time during which at least one factor of production is fixed. So that's a key bit of information. Really, when we say one factor of production is fixed, what we're talking about is capital. Capital is the factor of production that's fixed in the short run. The long run then, so that's a period of time during which all factors of production are variable or that they can be adjusted. So it's best understood maybe through an example. So let's say I said to you that there's a coffee shop or a cafe in your local area and it's doing really well. There's been a real sudden increase in demand and they want to increase their outputs and make more coffees so they can take advantage of that, make more money. And to do that, they'd need to increase their use of factors of production. So their options are they can increase the amount of labor they have, so the amount of workers they have, or they could increase the amount of capital they have. So let's say capital for them might be their premises. So there are two options, more workers or increase the size of your premises so you can add more seating. Out of those two options, the only one that they could do immediately is to add more workers. They could maybe stay open a bit later and convince existing staff to maybe work overtime. They could hire extra workers to work those extra hours because they wouldn't be able to increase the size of their premises overnight. They'd have to maybe apply for planning, have to get a builder, actually have to go and build it, that type of thing. So in the immediate sort of period there, they can change the amount of labor they use, but their capital is fixed. Now, over a longer period of time, they can actually increase the size of their premises and add more seating. So eventually, yes, capital can be increased. So I guess the best way to think about it is like the long run is basically as long as it takes for business to be able to increase the amount of capital they have. It's probably the best way to think about it. The other thing I want to point out to you there is these two definitions of normal profit and supernormal profit. So again, two terms that, yeah, we're going to come across them here, but we'll see them a lot when we do market structures again. So important definition here of normal profit, so make sure you can explain this. It's the minimum profit necessary for a firm to stay in business in the long run. So imagine you were trying to evaluate whether doing some sort of business project was worthwhile or not. You're an entrepreneur and you're thinking, is this worth my time and energy or not? And you might think to yourself, well, I'll only do it if I can make 10 grand out of it. And I can't make 10 grand out of it, I won't do it. That's the minimum amount that would be necessary for you to undertake that project or to stay in that business. So that's kind of the idea. And it should be viewed as a kind of a cost. And that's something you might want to take note of there. So I'm going to just write that in. Normal profit should be viewed as a cost in the long run. I'll explain why in a second. So normal profit can be viewed like a cost in the long run. And the reason it should be viewed like a cost is because in that situation that I just mentioned to you there about the potential business project, the money that you make from your sales in that project, yes, it has to cover all your costs, but for you to actually do it, it also has to cover the 10 grand, otherwise you won't do it. So it's like an additional cost that must be covered. And when we do exam questions, the reason I'm saying that and getting you to write it in is because when we do exam questions a bit later on in this topic, we are going to treat it like a cost. The other thing then there is supernormal profit. So supernormal profit's pretty straightforward. It's just anything above normal profit. So it's profit over and above the normal profit. That's what it is. So like in that example that we just did, like let's say you make 12 grand from that entrepreneurial project or that business project or that job. Well, then you've made 2 grand over and above what you were happy with. So that 2 grand is supernormal profit. The other thing I'll point out to you at this stage is the conditions there. If you look in the next box down, if you look at this box here, where it says the relationship between average cost, which is AC there, and average revenue. Now, they're two terms that we'll be more familiar with that you'll be more familiar with as you work through the videos. But just know that anytime you're talking about supernormal profit or normal profit in an exam, you would always mention the relationship between average cost and average revenue. So what we say is, right, that normal profit exists where average revenue is equal to average cost. So anytime you're talking about that, particularly in market structures exam questions, and you reference a normal profit, just say AR equals AC, because that's what the examiner wants to see, that you know that. And then with supernormal profit, you're always going to say the average revenue is greater than average cost. So it'll make more sense when you've worked through the entire topic and worked through a bit of market structures. But the big thing to take away at this stage is just to know I'm always going to mention the relationship between average cost and average revenue when I'm talking about either normal or supernormal profit. So the next thing there is to work through the types of costs that a business faces. So the first one there you have is fixed costs. This is pretty straightforward. These are basically costs that just don't change as output changes. And the best example of a fixed cost, and the one that you'll see most commonly in sort of exam questions, is rent. Rent is the most common example. So let's say that I'm going to start a business and I'm gonna make donuts, and I need to rent a kitchen space to do that. And let's say that kitchen space costs $5 grand a month. So I pay at the start of the month, let's say I pay my $5 grand, and that gives me rent of the premises for the next 30 days or whatever it is. Now it doesn't matter if I go ahead and make 100 donuts, 200 donuts, no donuts, 1,000 donuts, it's still $5 grand, right? So that $5 grand doesn't depend on how much I make or how much I produce. It's completely separate to it. So that's what a fixed cost is. It's a cost that doesn't change as output changes. My output there doesn't matter. I'm still going to pay $5 grand. A variable cost, well, that's a cost that does vary as output changes. So to come back to my donut example, ingredients there would be a variable cost. The more donuts I make, the more ingredients I use, and the more my variable costs go up. So the more you make, the more ingredients you use, the higher your variable costs. Just in terms of what they look like in a diagram, now you might have to plot these out in an exam question, and it's a bit like what we did with supply and demand, where you just plot out, you'll be given data and you just have to plot out your points and join the dots. But just so you have a general sense of what those should look like if you're drawing them, fixed costs will always be a horizontal line, because if you look here at an output of 10 units, fixed costs here are 10 grand, but also at an output of 1,000 units, fixed costs are still 10 grand. So it'll always be the same regardless of output. And then variable costs will always look like that. It'll slope upwards from left to right. And the reason for that is because as output increases, variable costs increase. So at a quantity of 10, variable costs are a tenner, but at an output of 100, variable costs are 100. So as output increases, your variable costs increase. Total cost then is just the next one there, and that's just a combination of your fixed and your variable added together. That's all it is. So it's just your fixed and your variable added together. Very straightforward. What that would look like is, it looks like that. So it's an upward sloping line, but the key thing here is it starts here and not down here. And the reason for that is because we're factoring in fixed costs. Like total cost is fixed plus variable. And remember, you'll always have fixed costs even if you produce nothing. So that's why if you fixed costs start there, so that's why total cost starts there as well. It's because their fixed costs are part of total costs. The next one then is your marginal cost. So this is just the extra cost of making an extra unit, or it's the additional cost to produce an extra unit. Or you could look at it like it's the change in total costs from producing an extra unit. So it's very similar to what we had with marginal utility. So if you remember, marginal utility is the extra utility you get from consuming another unit, while marginal cost is the extra cost from producing another unit of good. Now, a crucial thing to take note of there, anytime you see marginal cost in an exam or anything like that, be sure to know that, or remember that you can't calculate marginal cost until you know total cost. Same way that you can't calculate marginal utility until you know total utility. It's the exact same thing there. So it's really important. You can't calculate marginal cost until you know your total cost. Because marginal cost is the change in total cost from producing an extra unit. Next one there is explicit cost. They're just money, the monetary cost of producing something. So things like wages, things like raw materials, that type of thing. You won't come across that one that often, and same with implicit costs. So implicit costs are kind of non-monetary costs, like that are hard to quantify, such as like the investment of someone's time, that type of thing. And the final one, opportunity cost, would have come across this initially in that strand one, is the cost of foregone alternatives. So it's the next best alternative option when making a choice, what you give up. So just finish this by looking quickly at exam question from 2022 on this stuff. So the context of this question was, there was something about like, it was related to house building anyway. And the question says, choose by means of a tick which type of cost best describes each of the following and explain your choice. So you're given a couple of building expenses. So the first one is bags of cement. So is that something that the more you make, the more you use? Yes, it is. So that means it's a variable cost. So the more houses you make, the more cement you use. And that's the definition of a variable cost. As output increases, costs increase. So it is a variable cost there. The explanation, as more output, houses in this case are produced, more of that raw material is used. As output increases, so does the cost of production. So it's a variable cost. Next one there is labor. So labor is always a variable cost. The more stuff you make, the more workers you need. As output increases, so does the cost. So that's a variable cost. As more output, in this case, is again, the example was houses, are produced, more of labor is needed. So as production increases, so do your variable costs. And then the last one was the production price of a construction site. So we're assuming here that the site is kind of purchased in advance. So now the builder is left with a vacant site. So it doesn't matter how many houses they built, whether it's 1, 2, 10, they've already paid that. So it's an example of a fixed cost. Regardless of whether more or less houses are produced, the site will still need to be paid for. So it doesn't matter whether one house or 100 houses are built on it, the cost remains the same. And that's the key thing. With fixed cost, they stay the same regardless of output. They do not increase as output increases. So the big thing just from that list, knowing that total cost is a combination of fixed and variable, and marginal cost is that extra cost from producing another unit of something. You can't calculate your marginal cost until you know your total cost.